As soon as humans become aware of their own mortality, they are tormented by a simple but impossible question. How do we cheat death, or at least extend our short lives for as long as possible? Since a person rarely lives for more than 100 years, the handful of centenarians who defy the odds and defeat this barrier capture the imagination and inspire fascination in those of us who dream of delaying their demise. Yet if the stories are true, one man went a step further and became the oldest person in history, achieving the unthinkable by living for an incredible 152 years. His remarkable life spanning the reign of 10 monarchs, and seeing him marry and have children when he was 120, his unusual ability to delay death, capturing the attention of the king himself, and making him an overnight celebrity until his body finally succumbed to the ravages of time. Thomas Parr is thought to have been born in a small English hamlet in 1483 during the final years of the tumultuous 100 Years' War between England and France. For most young men born during this time, a short, hard life of back-breaking agricultural labour lay ahead. However, unlike the rest of his childhood friends, Thomas Parr's life was destined to take a more unusual course. Little is known of Parr's early years, other than that the first few decades of his life proved relatively unremarkable, his days spent toiling in the fields as a simple farmer. However, as the years began to pass, and his family, friends, and neighbours passed away, it became clear that the grizzled old farmer was no average man. Parr is said to have remained a bachelor until he was 80 years old, when he decided to finally settle down and marry the woman who would become his first wife. The newlyweds had 2 children together, however tragically both died in infancy. At around the age of 100, Parr had an affair with a local woman and fathered his 3rd child out of wedlock. When the scandalous transgression was discovered, the shocked community forced the shamed adulterer to perform a public penance in the church porch, the centenarian made to stand draped in a white sheet for a set period of time to atone for being unfaithful. 10 years after his first wife's death, Parr remarried at the age of 122, the pair living together for a further 12 years. His second wife said to have reported that her husband, who was by now already the oldest man in the world, showed no sign of his advanced age or infirmity of any kind. By now, word of the man who neighbours refer to as Old Parr had begun to spread, the legend of a man who had outlived generations of his neighbours, attracting curious visitors from far and wide. Upon hearing rumours of a 152-year-old man living on one of his estates, the Earl of Arundel decided to visit Parr and see for himself whether or not the stories held any merit. After meeting the withered ancient man, who by now could barely walk unaided, the Earl was so convinced that these stories were true that he arranged to take Parr all the way to London for an audience with the king himself, where he would be presented as a curious piece of nature. Unable to refuse such an offer, Parr left his native Shropshire and began the long journey south to the capital. He would never see home again. As the entourage passed through towns and cities on their way to the court of King Charles I, large crowds of curious onlookers swarmed around Parr's carriage as they attempted to hear him speak and even touch him, perhaps hoping that his miraculous ability to delay death might be contagious. However, the crowd's stifling attention quickly took its toll on the old farmer, who had spent his entire life living and working amongst wide open spaces, and by the time he reached London, he was said to have been nearly completely blind as he grew increasingly feeble. Despite the journey inflicting severe adverse effects on his health, Parr seems to have enjoyed the attention he received upon arriving in London, where he became something of a celebrity amongst the city's social elite, whose boredom was momentarily relieved by the arrival of this curious 152-year-old man from the north. Parr had his portrait painted by some of the greatest artists of the day, and his likeness is still displayed in the National Portrait Gallery in London today, while his free time was spent consuming the city's finest foods and wines, as the adoring crowds who arrived to visit him discussed whether his reported age could possibly be true. Upon finally meeting King Charles I, the king is said to have asked Parr what he had done more than other men during his life, to which Parr simply recalled the penance he had completed as punishment for his adultery all those years ago, an answer which surprised the king, who was somewhat disturbed that the old man seemed only to remember his vices. Despite this, the king is said to have become fond of Parr, showering him with expensive gifts and treating him to the kinds of lavish meals and luxuries that a simple, low-born farmer could only dream of. However, Tom's newfound appetites did not come without a cost. The change in diet, excessive consumption of alcohol, and stifling pollution of the city, resulting in him falling gravely ill just 2 weeks after his arrival. This drastic change in lifestyle had proved too much for the old man to take, and on November 13th, 1635, Thomas Parr died at the reported age of 152, the brief fame he had achieved in his final days also resulting in his demise. Curious as to what could have possibly killed a man who had defied death for so long, the king ordered his personal physician to carry out an autopsy, no doubt hoping to discover the secrets to extending one's life. Amazingly, the autopsy revealed Parr to be in generally good health, his internal organs described as being in perfect condition, and it was generally accepted that he had died of pneumonia caused by the sudden and drastic change of lifestyle brought on by his trip to London, with many believing that he would have likely lived even longer had he remained in his native Shropshire with its clean air and continued to consume the same simple diet he had eaten for more than a century and a half. The king arranged for Parr to be buried at Westminster Abbey, a place usually reserved for royalty and other elite members of society, and his grave can still be seen today. The remarkable life of Tom Parr had finally come to an end, but the debate over just how he might have lived for so long, and whether or not his story was even remotely true in the first place, rages on. Parr had always attributed his long life to his simple diet of cheese and milk, hard bread and sour whey, with the physician who performed his autopsy noting that his impressive physical condition at the time of death was most probably derived from his relatively stress-free life in the countryside, coupled with daily physical activity and a good night's sleep. Yet historians today doubt that Parr was even remotely close to being 152 years old, with most suggesting that he was unlikely to be older than 70. There are no reliable written documents to verify his age, as birth certificates were not kept in England until the 19th century. In the 15th century, all births would have been recorded by the local church at baptisms and weddings. However, any such mention of Tom Parr has failed to survive the passing of time. Parr's claims that he was born in 1483 were never challenged by his neighbours, most of whom would have been lucky to reach 60 years of age. There was simply nobody left alive from Parr's generation who could have verified or debunked his claim. As if his date of birth was in fact genuine, it would mean that Parr would have outlived at least 2 generations of his neighbours. As far as most people were concerned, Tom Parr was old when they were born, and old when they died. It is possible that Parr's birth record was confused with that of his grandfather. Both men shared the same name, with a simple administrative error by the local church potentially causing the confusion over the birth date. A possibility further reinforced by the fact that Parr could never remember any specific events from the 15th century when questioned, indicating that either age had ravaged his memory, or more likely that he was simply not born until much later. Yet perhaps the most damning evidence lies in the sheer improbability of anyone living to such an age. At that time in England, the average life expectancy was thought to be as low as 40. And even in the present day, living beyond 100 is extremely rare, despite our greater understanding of the human body and access to modern medicine. Fewer than 1 in 1,000 people who make it to 100 will reach the age of 110, with a recent study finding just 663 confirmed cases of a person living to 110 or more. Yet despite such doubts over the veracity of his claim, the story of the 152-year-old Tom Parr has nevertheless survived the passing of the centuries, no doubt fueled by our eternal fascination with death and the desire to break free from its limitations. I hope you enjoyed the video. Do you think it's possible for a person to live to such an advanced age? Let me know what you think in the comments below, and I'll see you again soon.